There are mornings that arrive like any other, and then there are mornings that arrive carrying the weight of everything you thought you knew about yourself, cracked open and bleeding light. This was the latter. I sat at my kitchen table in the half-darkness before dawn, watching my wedding band spin in slow, lazy circles on the wooden surface. I had set it there an hour ago, maybe two. Time had become elastic, meaningless. The gold caught what little light filtered through the window blinds, throwing tiny fragments of brilliance across the table before settling into stillness again. I wasn't sure if I had the right to put it back on. Next to the ring lay a piece of paper, folded once, then twice, as if whoever wrote it couldn't bear to let the words breathe freely in the world. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was careful, deliberate, the kind of script that belonged to someone who still believed words mattered, that they could change things. I had read it so many times the creases were wearing soft, but the words hadn't lost their power to stop my breath. I just wanted to know what it felt like to be someone's first. And I chose you. The house held its breath around me. Clara was still sleeping upstairs, her body curved away from the empty space where I should have been lying. Evan's alarm wouldn't go off for another hour, and then there would be the familiar chaos of morning routines, coffee brewing, backpacks searched for forgotten homework, the careful choreography of a family that had learned to move around the spaces I occupied without really seeing me. But for now, there was only this, the tick of the clock on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator, and the sound of my own breathing, shallow and uneven. My eyes burned, dry from staring at nothing, wet from everything else. I couldn't remember the last time I had cried. Maybe I had forgotten how. The confession had arrived yesterday evening, handed to me after the school hallways had emptied, after the last locker had slammed shut, and the custodial staff had begun their quiet work of erasing the day. Julian had lingered by my classroom door, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a student working up the courage to ask about a failing grade. But when he finally spoke, his words weren't a question. They were a choice he had made, a truth he was offering like something fragile and irreplaceable. I had laughed at first, not from cruelty, but from the sheer impossibility of it. The sound had echoed off the empty walls, hollow and unconvincing even to my own ears. But Julian hadn't laughed back. He had simply stood there, watching me with those steady eyes that seemed to see through every careful wall I had built around myself over 20 years of marriage, 18 years of teaching, 43 years of living a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Now, in the growing light of morning, I understood what he had really been offering. Not just his inexperience, his curiosity, his trust. He had been offering me a mirror, a chance to see myself as I truly was rather than as I had convinced everyone, including myself, that I should be. The weight of that gift, of being chosen for such a moment of revelation, settled into my chest like a stone. What does it mean to be chosen for a truth that costs everything? I turned the question over in my mind as I watched the shadows on the wall shift and lengthen. Soon, Clara would wake. Soon, Evan would stumble downstairs looking for breakfast and his lost soccer cleats. Soon, I would have to decide whether to slide that ring back onto my finger and pretend that yesterday had never happened, or find the courage to leave it spinning on the table like a compass needle pointing toward a future I couldn't yet imagine. My name is Nathaniel Porter, though I have spent so many years being Mr. Porter to my students, honey to my wife, and dad to my son that I sometimes forget the weight of my own name when spoken aloud. I am 43 years old, a high school literature teacher who has spent the last 18 years guiding teenagers through the pages of books about lives more passionate and dangerous than the one I have chosen to live. Our house sits in the middle of Maple Street, a modest two-story colonial with white shutters and a front porch that Clara painted sage green 3 summers ago. It looks like every other house on our block, which is exactly what we wanted when we bought it 15 years ago. Safe. Predictable. The kind of place where children ride bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors wave from their driveways. The kind of place where no one asks uncomfortable questions about the spaces between what you show the world and what you keep hidden. Clara is already moving through the kitchen when I finally put the ring back on my finger and fold the letter into my shirt pocket. She has always been an early riser, one of those people who seems to draw energy from the morning itself. Her dark hair is pulled back in the loose bun she wears for her job at the medical office downtown, and she hums something under her breath as she measures coffee into the machine. The sound is soft, unconscious, the kind of contentment that comes from years of routine. She doesn't ask where I was last night when I came home after 10 o'clock, claiming I had stayed late to grade papers. She doesn't comment on the fact that I've been sitting in the kitchen since before sunrise, or that my eyes probably look like I haven't slept. Clara has learned, over the years, not to push too hard into the quiet spaces I inhabit. I think she mistakes my distance for the ordinary fatigue of middle age, the natural settling that happens when two people have been married for 20 years and have said most of what they have to say to each other. Evan thunders down the stairs at 7:15, all elbows and energy and the particular chaos that belongs to 17-year-old boys. His hair sticks up in 3 different directions, and he's wearing yesterday's t-shirt with a torn collar that Clara has been threatening to throw away for months. He looks like his mother around the eyes, but he has my height and my tendency toward distraction. He grabs a piece of toast from the counter, kisses Clara's cheek with automatic affection, and gives me a nod that acknowledges my presence without requiring conversation. I love my son with a fierce, protective instinct that sometimes surprises me with its intensity. But I also feel, watching him move through the world with such uncomplicated certainty about who he is and what he wants, a kind of envy that sits uncomfortably in my chest. He is everything I was not at his age: confident, popular, comfortable in his own skin. He plays soccer and dates a sweet girl named Madison and talks easily about his plans for college. His life unfolds before him like a map with clearly marked roads, while mine feels like I have been wandering in circles for decades. The morning routine continues around me like a well-rehearsed play. Clara packs Evan's lunch and reminds him about his chemistry test. She refills my coffee cup without being asked and mentions that her sister called about Thanksgiving plans. I respond at the appropriate moments, making the sounds of a husband and father engaged with the rhythms of his family's life, but I feel like I am watching all of this from somewhere outside myself. This is the architecture of the life I have built. Careful, considered, constructed to look from the outside like contentment. I teach Fitzgerald and Steinbeck and Morrison to students who are the same age I was when I first read their books and felt something stir inside me that I didn't have words for. I come home to a house that smells like whatever Clara has planned for dinner, to a son who needs help with his college applications, to a wife who still sometimes reaches for my hand when we're watching television in the evenings. It is a good life by any reasonable measure. I am respected at work, loved at home, secure in the knowledge that I have fulfilled the expectations that were laid out for me before I was old enough to question them. I married a woman I cared about, raised a son who is becoming a man I admire, built something stable and lasting in a world that seems increasingly uncertain. But there has always been something else, a current running beneath the surface of this carefully maintained existence. A sense that I am performing rather than living, that I have become expert at being the person everyone expects me to be, while the person I might actually be remains locked away in some interior room I have trained myself not to enter. It's there in the way I sometimes catch myself staring too long at certain colleagues, or the way my breath catches when I read particular passages in the books I teach. It's there in the dreams I have sometimes forgotten by morning, but that leave me feeling unsettled and strangely hollow. It's there in the moments when Clara asks me what I'm thinking about, and I realize I have no idea how to answer her truthfully. As Clara gathers her purse and keys, preparing for another day at work, and Evan disappears back upstairs to presumably find clean clothes, I sit alone again at the kitchen table. The house will be quiet soon, and I will have to decide whether to drive to school and face Julian Hayes across a staff meeting table, pretending that yesterday evening never happened, or find some way to call in sick and spend the day trying to convince myself that I imagined the whole thing. The letter in my pocket seems to pulse with its own weight, a small paper heart beating against my ribs. I just wanted to know what it felt like to be someone's first, and I chose you. The words circle through my mind like water finding the same groove in stone, wearing deeper with each repetition until I can't tell whether they terrify me or offer me something I've been waiting my whole life to receive. I drive to school through streets I have traveled for 18 years, past the same coffee shop where Clara and I had our first date, past the park where I taught Evan to ride his bicycle when he was 6. The familiar landmarks feel strange this morning, as if I am seeing them through different eyes, or perhaps seeing them clearly for the first time. The letter in my pocket seems to radiate heat against my chest, a constant reminder of the fault line that has opened up in the careful geography of my life. The school building rises before me, red brick and tall windows, the same institution where I have spent more waking hours than in my own home. I park in my usual spot, third row back, and sit for a moment in the silence of my car. I can see other teachers arriving, carrying their coffee cups and canvas bags full of papers to grade, settling into another day of routine. I wonder if any of them have ever felt the way I do right now, like they are about to walk into their own life, wearing someone else's skin. Julian Hayes arrived at our school 3 months ago, hired to teach art classes and coordinate the after-school painting program. He is 28 years old, though something in his eyes suggests he has seen more of the world than most people twice his age. He has dark hair that never quite lies flat, and a way of moving through the hallways that suggests he is always slightly surprised to find himself in such a structured, predictable place. I first noticed him during the staff meeting in August, sitting near the back of the room while Principal Matthews droned through budget reports and policy updates. While the rest of us sat with the practiced patience of people who have endured countless such meetings, Julian sketched in the margins of his handout, his pencil moving in quick, confident strokes. I found myself watching the movement of his hands rather than listening to the presentation, wondering what images he was creating while the rest of us simply endured the passage of time. Our first conversation happened in the faculty lounge 3 weeks later. I was heating my lunch in the microwave when he came in carrying a sandwich wrapped in brown paper and an apple that looked like it had been picked that morning. He asked if the coffee was as terrible as it looked, and I told him it was worse, but that you developed a tolerance after a few years. He laughed, a sound that seemed too bright for the fluorescent-lit room, and said he supposed that was true of most things about this place. We talked about nothing significant. The weather, the students, the way the building's heating system seemed to have its own mysterious logic. But there was something underneath the surface of our ordinary conversation, a kind of recognition that I couldn't name at the time. He asked me what I taught, and when I said English literature, his face lit up with genuine interest. He told me he had been an English major before switching to art, that he still read voraciously, that there was something about the way language could create entire worlds that amazed him. The conversations became more frequent after that. He would find reasons to stop by my classroom during lunch periods, or I would discover myself lingering in the hallway near the art room after school, listening to the sound of students laughing and the scrape of easels being moved. We talked about books, about the particular challenges of teaching creative subjects to teenagers, about the way certain pieces of art or literature could reach inside you and rearrange something fundamental. He told me he had grown up in a small town in Montana, that he had come east to find something he couldn't quite articulate. I told him about the years I had spent believing I wanted to be a writer, about the novel I had started and abandoned in graduate school, about the way teaching had become both a compromise with my dreams and a way of staying connected to the words that had once seemed so important. These were not conversations I had ever had with my other colleagues, most of whom I had worked alongside for years without ever moving beyond discussions of lesson plans and administrative frustrations. There was something about Julian that invited honesty, a quality of attention that made you feel like whatever you were saying mattered to him in a way that went beyond politeness. He would lean forward slightly when you spoke, his eyes focused on your face rather than drifting around the room. And he had a way of asking follow-up questions that suggested he was actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. The shift happened gradually, so slowly that I didn't recognize it until it was already complete. What had started as collegial conversations became something more personal, more necessary. I found myself looking forward to our talks with an intensity that surprised me, planning things I might tell him, remembering details from our previous conversations with the kind of precision I usually reserved for my favorite passages of literature. One evening in late October, I was cleaning my classroom after the last bell when Julian appeared in my doorway. The building was mostly empty, just a few teachers finishing up for the day and the distant sound of the custodial crew beginning their work. He stood on the threshold as if he wasn't sure he had permission to enter, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his jacket. He said he had been thinking about something I had mentioned the previous week, about the way certain moments in books seemed to capture something true about desire that most people spent their whole lives afraid to acknowledge. I had been discussing a passage from James Baldwin, the way Baldwin wrote about longing with such unflinching honesty that it made you feel exposed just reading it. Julian stepped into the room then, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have. He said he wanted to tell me something, that he had been thinking about it for weeks and couldn't get it out of his mind. I set down the papers I had been grading and turned to face him, some part of me already knowing that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "I've never been with a man before," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I just want to know what it feels like to be someone's first. And I chose you." The words hung in the air between us like something visible, something that had weight and texture and the power to reshape the space around them. I laughed, not because I found it funny, but because laughter was the only response that felt safe in that moment. The sound echoed off the empty walls, hollow and unconvincing. But Julian didn't laugh back. He simply stood there, watching me with those steady eyes that seemed to see through every careful defense I had built around myself. His expression was serious, vulnerable, but not uncertain. This was not a moment of confusion or experimentation for him. This was a choice he had made, a truth he was offering like something rare and irreplaceable. Something shifted inside me then, though I tried to dismiss it, tried to place his words in the realm of things that happened to other people in other lives. But I could feel it anyway, a recognition that went deeper than thought, a stirring of something I had kept buried so long I had almost convinced myself it didn't exist. In the days that followed Julian's confession, I moved through my life like someone recovering from a fever. Everything appeared the same from the outside. I taught my classes, graded papers, sat through faculty meetings, came home to Clara and Evan. But something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of my awareness. It was as if Julian's words had turned on a light in a room I had spent decades pretending didn't exist, and now I could see the dust motes dancing in the air, the shadows I had never noticed, the way the familiar furniture looked different in this new illumination. I tried, at first, to pretend that nothing had changed. When I saw Julian in the hallways, I nodded politely and kept walking. When he appeared in my classroom doorway during lunch, I found excuses to be busy, to shuffle papers, or update my lesson plans with unnecessary urgency. But avoidance, I discovered, was its own form of acknowledgement. The more deliberately I ignored him, the more present he became in my thoughts, like a word you try not to think about that suddenly appears everywhere you look. It was Julian who finally broke the stalemate. A week after his confession, I found a note in my mailbox in the faculty lounge, written in his careful handwriting on a piece of paper torn from a sketchbook. It said simply, "Coffee after school? No pressure. Just coffee." Below that, he had drawn a small sketch of a coffee cup, steam rising from it in delicate, curving lines that somehow managed to suggest both warmth and fragility. I stared at the note for a long time, holding it between my fingers like something that might disappear if I handled it too roughly. Around me, other teachers sorted through their own mail, complained about parent conferences, discussed weekend plans with the easy familiarity of people whose lives contained no fault lines, no secret rooms, no questions they were afraid to answer. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my pocket next to the letter he had given me that first evening, the one I still carried but had not read again since that morning in my kitchen. I met him at a small cafe downtown, a place I had never been before, where the walls were lined with local artwork and the baristas knew their customers' names. Julian was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table near the back, his hands wrapped around a mug that looked handmade, imperfect in a way that suggested someone had shaped it with care rather than machinery. He looked up when I entered, and his face broke into a smile that seemed to contain both relief and something that might have been hope. We talked for 2 hours, though it felt like minutes and also like years. He told me about growing up in Montana, about the vastness of the sky there, and the way it made you feel simultaneously insignificant and infinite. He talked about his decision to leave, about the sense that there were parts of himself he would never understand if he stayed in a place where everyone had known him since childhood. I found myself telling him things I had never said aloud, about the years in graduate school when I had felt closest to becoming the person I thought I wanted to be, about the slow process of compromise that had led me to the life I now inhabited. We did not talk about what he had said in my classroom. We did not need to. It was there between us like a third presence at the table, shaping the rhythm of our conversation, the way we leaned forward when the other spoke, the particular quality of attention we paid to each other's words. I watched his hands as he gestured, the way his fingers moved when he described a painting he was working on, and felt something stir inside me that I had no name for. When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car, even though his apartment was in the opposite direction. We stood beside my door for a moment, neither of us quite ready to end the evening, and he said he hoped we could do this again. I heard myself saying yes before I had consciously decided to respond, and the sound of my own voice agreeing to something I couldn't quite articulate felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff I hadn't realized I was standing on. The coffee meetings became regular, then frequent, then necessary. We would sit across from each other in various cafes around town, always choosing places where we were unlikely to run into colleagues or neighbors, though we never explicitly acknowledged this shared instinct for privacy. Our conversations ranged across literature and art, childhood memories and future dreams, the particular challenges of teaching young people who were still becoming themselves. But underneath everything we said ran a deeper current, an awareness of each other that made even discussions of curriculum feel charged with significance. It was during one of these conversations that Julian mentioned he liked to walk in Riverside Park on weekend mornings, that there was something about being near water that helped him think more clearly. He said it casually, without looking directly at me, as if he were simply sharing information rather than extending an invitation. But I understood, and the following Saturday, I found myself walking the trails that wound along the river, ostensibly enjoying the autumn air, but actually scanning the paths ahead for a familiar figure. I found him sitting on a bench overlooking the water, sketching something in a small pad balanced on his knee. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and his face transformed with a smile that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. He said he was glad I had come, that he had been hoping I might, and I realized that we had crossed some invisible threshold, that we were no longer pretending this was coincidence. We walked together along the river path, past families with children and couples holding hands and joggers focused on their own internal rhythms. The conversation flowed as easily as it did in the cafes, but there was something different about being in motion together, about sharing physical space in the open air. I found myself acutely aware of the distance between us, the way our hands swung at our sides, sometimes almost touching, the moment when he stepped closer to point out a hawk circling overhead, and I caught the scent of his soap, something clean and unfamiliar that made me want to breathe more deeply. These walks became part of our routine, though we never planned them explicitly. We would simply find each other on Saturday or Sunday mornings, as if drawn by some magnetic force neither of us wanted to examine too closely. Julian would bring his sketchbook, and sometimes he would stop to draw something that caught his attention. The way light fell through the trees, the reflection of clouds in the water, an elderly man feeding ducks with the patient devotion of someone who had been performing this ritual for years. I began to look forward to these mornings with an intensity that frightened me. I would wake early, spend extra time choosing what to wear, find myself checking my appearance in mirrors with the kind of attention I hadn't paid to such things since I was a teenager getting ready for my first date. I told Clara I had started jogging for exercise, that I needed the time alone to clear my head before the week began, and she seemed pleased that I was taking better care of myself. During our walks, Julian began to share more personal details of his life. He told me about relationships he had been in with women, about the way he had always felt like he was performing rather than truly connecting, about the growing sense that there was something missing from his understanding of himself. He spoke about desire with a frankness that both thrilled and terrified me, about the difference between wanting someone because it was expected and wanting someone because they awakened something in you that you hadn't known existed. In return, I found myself revealing things I had never said to anyone. I told him about nights when I was young, when I would lie awake feeling hollow and restless, convincing myself that what I felt was loneliness rather than something more specific and dangerous. I talked about the way I had chosen Clara not from passion, but from a sense that she was the kind of person I should love, that loving her would prove something about myself that I needed to believe. I described the slow process by which I had built my current life, layer by layer, like someone constructing a shelter against whether they refused to acknowledge. The tension between us grew with each conversation, each shared glance, each moment when our bodies occupied space in ways that felt deliberate rather than accidental. When we sat beside each other on park benches, I became hyper-aware of the warmth radiating from his skin. When he handed me his sketchbook to show me something he had drawn, our fingers would brush for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and I would feel electricity travel up my arm like a message written in a language I was only beginning to remember how to read. One afternoon, as we walked along a particularly secluded section of the river path, Julian stopped suddenly and turned to face me. The expression on his face was serious, almost solemn, and for a moment I thought he was about to tell me that we needed to stop these meetings, that we were moving into territory too dangerous to navigate. Instead, he said quietly that he had never felt more like himself than he did during these conversations with me, that for the first time in his life he understood what people meant when they talked about finding someone who truly saw them. I stood there on the path, surrounded by the sound of water moving over stones and wind rustling through the remaining leaves, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not breaking, but opening, like a door I had kept locked for so long I had forgotten I possessed the key. I wanted to reach for him, to close the small distance between us, to discover what it would feel like to touch someone who had chosen to offer me this gift of recognition. But I also felt the weight of my wedding ring on my finger, the pull of my other life waiting for me at home, the terrible mathematics of desire and consequence. Instead, I simply stood there, looking into his eyes, feeling more terrified and more alive than I had in decades. A man standing at the edge of a truth I had denied for so long, I had almost convinced myself it didn't exist. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon, casual enough that I might have dismissed it as nothing more than the kind of gesture one colleague makes to another. Julian lingered by my classroom door after the final bell had released the last of my students into the hallways, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his jacket in that way I had come to recognize as a sign that he was working up the courage to say something important. He mentioned that he had been working on some new pieces lately, paintings that he was particularly excited about, and wondered if I might be interested in seeing them. His apartment wasn't far from the school, he said, just a few blocks away in one of those old converted houses where young teachers and artists rented rooms with high ceilings and questionable heating. He said it like an afterthought, like someone mentioning the weather or commenting on the day's lessons, but I could hear something else underneath the casual words, a tension that made my pulse quicken. I told him I would like that, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too careful, too deliberate. We arranged to meet on Thursday evening, after Clara would be at her book club and Evan would be at soccer practice, though I didn't tell Julian about these scheduling considerations. I simply said Thursday would work well for me. The days between the invitation and the appointment stretched like a held breath. I found myself distracted during classes, losing track of my thoughts mid-sentence while discussing symbolism in The Great Gatsby or the use of point of view in Morrison's Beloved. At home, I moved through the familiar routines of family life with the mechanical precision of someone whose attention was entirely elsewhere. Clara asked if I was feeling well, if perhaps I was coming down with something, and I assured her I was simply tired from the demands of the semester. Thursday evening arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt like a gift from whatever forces govern such things. I told Clara I was going for a longer walk than usual, that I needed to clear my head, and she looked up from her book with the mild concern of someone who has learned not to push too hard into the private spaces of her husband's inner life. I kissed her cheek, something I did automatically, without thinking, a gesture so habitual it felt like putting on a coat, and stepped out into the evening air. Julian's apartment occupied the third floor of a Victorian house that had been carved up into small living spaces for people who didn't need much room, but required high ceilings and windows that let in good light. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step feeling simultaneously inevitable and impossible, until I reached the door with his name written on a piece of masking tape in his familiar handwriting. He opened the door before I had finished knocking, as if he had been watching from the window, waiting for me to arrive. He was wearing a paint-stained shirt and jeans with holes at the knees, and his hair was more disheveled than usual, suggesting he had been working until the moment I arrived. Behind him, I could see a small living space that seemed to overflow with color and creativity and the particular kind of organized chaos that belongs to people who think with their hands. The apartment was exactly what I had imagined and nothing like I had expected. Canvases leaned against walls in various states of completion, some barely begun sketches, others layered with paint so thick I could see the texture of brushstrokes from across the room. Books were stacked on every available surface, many of them art books filled with reproductions of paintings I recognized, and many more I didn't. An easel stood near the largest window, holding a painting that looked like it might be a landscape, though the colors were so vivid and unexpected that it seemed more like a memory of a place than a literal representation. Julian stepped back to let me enter, and I found myself pausing on the threshold, not from uncertainty, but from a sudden awareness that crossing into this space would mean something different than all the careful distances we had maintained in coffee shops and on park benches. This was his private world, the place where he lived when no one was watching, where he created things that came from the most honest parts of himself. He showed me the paintings he had mentioned, guiding me from canvas to canvas with the kind of enthusiasm that made his whole face light up. He talked about color theory and composition, about the way certain combinations of hues could evoke emotions that had no names, about his ongoing attempt to capture something essential about light and shadow and the spaces between things. I listened, asked questions that seemed to delight him, but I was also acutely aware of his physical presence beside me, the way he moved through his own space with unconscious grace, the way his voice changed when he talked about work that mattered to him. When we had looked at the last of the paintings, a silence settled between us that felt different from the comfortable quiet of our previous conversations. We were standing near the window where the easel held his most recent work, and the light from outside was beginning to fade into the soft gray of early evening. Julian turned to face me, and I could see something in his expression that made my breath catch in my throat. "I don't just want to know what it feels like," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know what it feels like with you." The words hung in the air between us like something visible, something that changed the molecular structure of the space around us. I could feel my heart beating so hard I was certain he could hear it, could see the pulse at my throat that felt like it might give me away entirely. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to step back, to make some excuse, to retreat to the safety of my car and drive home to my other life, where such moments were impossible. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. Something deeper than thought, deeper than the careful architecture of the person I had trained myself to be, kept me rooted in place. Julian stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of paint and soap and something else that was purely him. He reached up slowly, giving me time to pull away, time to say no, time to remember all the reasons why this moment should not be happening. When I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't retreat, he placed his hand gently against my cheek. His palm was warm and slightly rough from working with his hands, and the touch sent electricity through my entire body, as if every nerve ending had suddenly come alive after years of numbness. "I want to know what it feels like with you," he repeated, even more softly, and then he leaned forward and kissed me. It was the most tentative kiss imaginable, a question more than a statement, a gesture so gentle it might have been a butterfly landing on my lips. But it was also the most profound moment of my life, an instant when everything I had believed about myself, everything I had constructed and maintained and defended, dissolved like sugar in rain. My hands were shaking as I lifted them to rest against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palms. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what I would do next, whether I would step into this new understanding of myself or retreat into the familiar territory of denial. I kissed him back, carefully, uncertainly, but with a hunger I hadn't known I possessed. I tasted truth for the first time in my life, and it terrified me more than any lie I had ever lived. But I also couldn't imagine, in that moment, how I had survived so many years without it. The kiss lasted only moments, but it created a fault line that ran through every aspect of my life. In the days that followed, I moved through my familiar routines like someone walking through the ruins of a building that had appeared solid until the earthquake revealed its fundamental instability. I taught my classes, graded papers, attended faculty meetings, but everything felt different now, colored by the memory of Julian's mouth against mine and the terrible recognition of what I had been denying for 43 years. At home, the distance between Clara and me seemed to widen with each passing day, though she said nothing directly about the change she must have sensed. She had always been perceptive in the way that people who love someone learn to read the subtle shifts in their partner's emotional weather. But now her glances lingered a moment too long when she thought I wasn't looking, and her questions about my day carried an undertone of something that might have been suspicion, or perhaps just the intuition that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of our marriage. I found myself unable to meet her eyes during dinner conversations, unable to participate in the easy domestic intimacy that had once felt natural, if not passionate. When she reached for my hand while we watched television in the evenings, I had to resist the urge to pull away, not from any lack of affection for her, but from the sudden awareness that my skin felt different now, as if Julian's touch had awakened nerve endings that had been dormant for decades. Evan, with the particular self-absorption of 17-year-old boys, seemed oblivious to the tension that had settled over our household like dust after an explosion. He continued his daily routine of school and soccer practice and long phone conversations with Madison, occasionally emerging from his room to grab food from the kitchen or ask for money for weekend activities. I watched him move through his life with such uncomplicated certainty about who he was and what he wanted, and felt a mixture of envy and protective love that made my chest ache. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening in November. I had stayed late at school, ostensibly to grade essays, but really because I couldn't bear the thought of sitting at my kitchen table, trying to make conversation with Clara while the memory of Julian's kiss burned in my mind like a brand. When I finally came home after 10 o'clock, the house was dark except for the lamp Clara always left on in the living room. I found her sitting in my usual chair at the kitchen table, still dressed in her work clothes, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She didn't look up when I entered, didn't ask where I had been or why I was so late. She simply sat there in the darkness, and somehow her silence was more accusatory than any question would have been. I stood in the doorway, watching her profile in the dim light filtering in from the street, and realized that she knew. Not the specifics, perhaps, but she knew that something irrevocable had happened, that the man who had kissed her cheek that morning before leaving for work was not the same man who stood before her now. The weight of her unasked questions pressed against me like a physical force, and I understood that I had reached a point where pretending was no longer possible. She finally looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the light from outside, and said quietly that she had been thinking we should take that trip to Europe we had always talked about, that maybe some time away together would be good for us. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the desperation underneath the words, the intuitive knowledge that our marriage was slipping away from us like water through cupped hands, and her desperate attempt to gather it back. I told her that sounded nice, that we should look into it, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. We both knew I was lying. We both knew that no amount of travel or new experiences could repair what was broken between us, because what was broken was not our relationship, but my understanding of myself, and therefore my capacity to be the husband she deserved. The next morning, I called Julian from my empty classroom during lunch period. I could hear the surprise in his voice when he answered, followed quickly by something that might have been hope. We had not spoken since the evening at his apartment, had avoided each other in the hallways with the careful precision of people who know that even casual contact might ignite something neither of them is prepared to handle. I asked if he could meet me after school, somewhere we could talk privately. He suggested a small cafe on the other side of town, a place neither of us had been before, where we were unlikely to encounter anyone we knew. I agreed, though every rational part of my mind screamed that meeting him was the last thing I should do, that the only safe course was to pretend that kiss had never happened and return to the careful distance we had maintained before. The cafe was dimly lit, with mismatched chairs and tables that looked like they had been collected from various garage sales. Julian was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking more serious than I had ever seen him. The easy smile that usually transformed his face when he saw me was absent, replaced by an expression of careful attention that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I sat across from him, ordered coffee I didn't want, and tried to find words for what I needed to say. The conversation we needed to have felt impossible, too large for the small space between us, too dangerous for the public setting we had chosen. But Julian, with his usual capacity for cutting through pretense, made it easier. "You're married," he said simply, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact that needed to be acknowledged before we could go any further. "You have a son. You have a life that doesn't include me, and I'm not asking you to destroy that." I looked at him across the small table, this young man who had somehow seen through all my careful defenses to the person I had kept hidden even from myself, and felt the weight of the impossible choice that lay before me. To continue the life I had built would mean pretending that kiss had never happened, that the recognition I had felt in his arms was just confusion or midlife crisis or any of the other explanations people use to dismiss truths too dangerous to acknowledge. But to step into the unknown with Julian would mean dismantling the world of my wife and son, admitting that the last 20 years of my life had been built on a foundation of self-deception so profound that I had almost convinced myself it was truth. "You don't have to choose me," Julian said, his voice quiet but steady. "But you can't keep choosing nothing." The words hit me like a physical blow because they named exactly what I had been doing for decades. I had been choosing nothing, the safe middle ground between desire and denial, the careful space where I could maintain my life without ever truly living it. I had been choosing the absence of choice, the illusion that I could continue indefinitely without ever confronting the fundamental question of who I actually was. I sat there in the dim light of the cafe, looking into the eyes of the man who had awakened something in me I had spent a lifetime trying to keep asleep, and understood with terrible clarity that he was right. To choose silence was to die slowly, to spend whatever years remained to me as a ghost haunting my own life. But to choose truth was to lose the only life I had ever known, to hurt people I loved, to step into a future I couldn't even begin to imagine. The terrible mathematics of desire and consequence stretched before me like an equation I couldn't solve, and I realized that whatever I chose, someone would pay the price for the years I had spent refusing to be honest about who I was. I am sitting at my kitchen table again, in the pale light that comes before dawn, watching the shadows change shape as the world prepares itself for another day. The house holds its breath around me the way it did that first morning after Julian's confession, but everything has changed since then. I have changed, though I'm not sure anyone looking at me would be able to see the difference. My wedding ring lies on the counter next to Clara's coffee cup, the one with the small chip on the handle that she refuses to throw away because I gave it to her on our first anniversary. The ring isn't spinning this time. It simply rests there, catching what little light filters through the blinds, looking smaller somehow than it did when I wore it every day for 20 years. From upstairs, I can hear the faint sound of Evan's laughter, probably talking to Madison on his phone before school, the kind of easy joy that belongs to people who have never had to question the fundamental assumptions of their lives. The sound is both beautiful and heartbreaking, a reminder of what innocence looks like, what it sounds like when someone moves through the world without carrying the weight of secrets that could destroy everything they've built. Clara is still sleeping. In an hour, she will come downstairs and begin her morning routine, make her coffee in the chipped cup, ask me if I slept well, pretend not to notice that I've been awake since 3 in the morning. She will move through our kitchen with the careful precision of someone who has learned to navigate around the spaces her husband occupies without quite understanding why those spaces feel different now. I have been writing a letter, my hand moving across the paper with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows that words, once written, have the power to change everything. It is not the kind of letter I once thought I might write if this moment ever came. It contains no declarations of love, no detailed explanations of what has happened or what I intend to do next. It is not an apology, though I feel the weight of all the things I should apologize for pressing against my chest like stones. Instead, it is simply an admission, an acknowledgement that I have spent 43 years afraid of my own truth, that I have built a life around the careful maintenance of a lie so fundamental I had almost convinced myself it was real. I write about the boy I was, who felt things he couldn't name and learned to bury them so deep he forgot they existed. I write about the man I became, who chose safety over honesty, who chose the life he thought he should want instead of discovering what he actually desired. I do not write Julian's name. I do not need to. Clara has always been intuitive, able to read between the lines of what I say and find the truths I'm too afraid to speak directly. She will understand that there is someone, that this awakening has a face and a voice and hands that have touched me in ways that revealed who I actually am beneath the careful performance I've maintained for decades. The letter is not long. Truth, I have discovered, does not require many words when you finally find the courage to speak it plainly. I fold it carefully, write Clara's name on the outside in the handwriting she has seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and the margins of books for 20 years. My hands are steadier than I expected them to be. I stand up from the table, feeling the weight of the decision settling into my bones like winter cold. I am not running away. I am not choosing Julian over my family, or my family over Julian. I am finally choosing to stop choosing nothing, to stop living in the careful space between truth and denial where I have spent most of my adult life. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if Clara will be able to forgive me for the years of deception, or if Evan will understand why his father had to dismantle the only life he had ever known in order to discover who he actually was. I don't know if Julian will still be waiting when I find the courage to face him honestly, or if the moment we shared in his apartment was simply that, a moment, beautiful and transformative, but not meant to become something lasting. What I know is that I cannot continue to live as a ghost in my own life, haunting the spaces between what I show the world and what I keep hidden. I cannot continue to choose the safety of lies over the terrible, beautiful risk of truth. I pick up the letter and walk to the front door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors Clara refinished 3 summers ago. I unlock the door and step out onto the porch, into air so cold I can see my breath forming small clouds that dissipate almost immediately. The street is quiet, the kind of stillness that belongs to the hour between night and morning when the world seems to be holding its breath. I stand there in the cold, feeling the paper in my hand, watching my breath rise and disappear in the gray air. For the first time in decades, it feels like I am finally exhaling after years of holding it in, finally releasing something I have been carrying so long I forgot it wasn't part of me. The morning stretches ahead, full of conversations I can't yet imagine, choices I'm not ready to make, a future that feels both terrifying and full of possibility. But I am no longer afraid of my own truth. And that, I think, is where everything else begins.